living on a town camp here in Alice Springs for most of my life. And I guess, you know, that saying, well, you know, there's no place like home, and Mount Nancy is my home, and that's where my heart is, that's where my family is, that's where we live in a communal structure. It's their traditional lands, but governments are calling them squatters. This is their home. How can you take somebody's home away from them? They've stopped the running water. They have no electricity out there except for solar. We are still living under the intervention. They want to make amendments to the Social Securities Act. In my experience with my Centrelink income, I've actually been cut off for 4 days, or, you know, I've had less income to feed my children. You know, up here in the Territory, there's a high incarceration rates of Aboriginal people, and most of them are women and children or youth. Like, I can't sit down outside of my home with my children and sit and yarn and carry on and do stuff with my kids without police coming to check us out all the time. At night it's worse because they're driving along slowly with their spotlights on, as if we're kangaroos sitting out in the scrub and they're spotlighting us. There is a racist element in this town, but the policies that the governments are handing down to the people makes it worse. Non-Aboriginal people tell us to go home. Now, where are we going to go home? The only place we're going to go home is to the house that we put our head to. So our little Greens party up here, and they come and stand alongside me at bottle shops, because we want to see the difference of how it is to be an Aboriginal in this town and not being able to enter into those doors and buy alcohol. Even if you are a working Aboriginal person, still paying taxes, you cannot sit in your own home or your yard and enjoy a drink after work. So these are the things that we have to deal with. I know that there are still a lot of health issues that we need to tackle, but then at the end of the day, you can't change your lifestyle if you're always going to be suppressed all the time. I think I'll put a hold on there and let the aunties talk.
Can I? I'm a great believer in radical thought, and a man called Malcolm X made one of the most profound statements I've ever heard, and I think it's as relevant for us today as it was when he made the statement however many years ago, probably in the 50s or 60s in the civil rights movement in America. But he said, "Only a fool lets his enemy educate his children." And that is what's happening to our children all across the country every day of the week. We're being indoctrinated into an alien system. This is not Britain. This is a little backward country that they thought there was no value in. Historically, people had come and gone and saw deserts and thought there wasn't much value in the landscape in this country. But since they've come here, they've certainly disavowed themselves of that ridiculous notion, because we're being raped every day by big business for our mineral resources and whatever other assets that this government and this country can illegally claim as their own. That's all part of the problem. We as people have never been recognised in this country. We're still treated as children. They came uninvited, they took things without the proper permissions being given or even asked of our people, and it's still happening to this day. We are still treated as children. We have no legal rights. We are legal minors within this country, within this system. And I think that really is a damnation on this country and on the world, because we are the oldest people. We have survived so much more longer than anyone else. We've lived through ice ages. We've lived through extreme droughts. We have lived through the most extreme conditions that can ever be thrown at us, and we have survived. What we can't survive is the killing of our people because of the racist intent of those who came. And that is the problem in this country. The racism is a sickness, and it's not treated as a sickness. It is rewarded continuously within this system, by this system. We only have to look at deaths in custody and the number of police, corrective services officers that have actually been rewarded by the system for a death in custody. Chris Hurley immediately springs to mind. There are many others. The problem is truth is such a hard thing to find when people tell lies all the time. It's for white Australians to understand that they are the purveyors and the bringers of the problem, and it's called racism, and that's what has to be dealt with by white Australia. We've seen situations arise that are so evil, so heinous in their acts, that you wouldn't think a human being is capable of it. The depravity, the barbarity that was brought to our people, heroes, leaders beheaded from the very beginning of our history, and right through the wars, the periods of the fighting, the illegal occupations of our countries, our leaders were beheaded. And that was to send a signal to the rest of us. A very obvious signal. If you talk too much or talk too loud or defend too much your country, this will happen to you. We have, for 200 years, they've been trying to cow us into compliance. I mean, how bad does it have to get, and how many bad prime ministers do you have to elect before you realise this system ain't working, will not work, cannot work, because of greed, the nature of greed. There's a way for it to work, but you're not going to hear that from the Knowles or the Warrens. It's a simple extension of an exercise in democracy. We become a tricameral system rather than a bicameral one. Elect a house, a black house, and we have representation all around the country from our people as traditional owners of their country. They have an equal say in all the laws. They must be passed by both houses, and we will let the Senate be the referee. Until you start looking and thinking along those lines, our justice will never be realised. You will continue to treat our people as animals, and you will not understand white Australia is the one with the problem, not us.
Thanks, Jim.
The stolen generation to me has never ever stopped. We have our babies ripped out of their mum's arms and taken away, and you don't get them back. Like, they put them under the minister till they're 18. They tell you there's risks, and you know, we as grandparents, we as community members, we're not suitable, but you don't get told why you're not suitable. As you've heard here today, we're a very communal race. We parent very differently. We're a community. It's not just mum and dad. They are still dispossessing. They are stealing those little babies. They're taking them out of country. Who's going to teach them their culture, their heritage, where they come from, the very essence of us as a people? You know, I grew up on a mission where there was a white manager and the Christian fellas, and they used to dictate as to who could go on the mish, how long you could stay. If you didn't go when they said you had to go, they'd bring the coppers. And there was also, back then when I was only little, that welfare element. There was a strong fear that you was going to get taken. Not to mention the trauma that's inflicted on these little ones. They're not with their loved ones. They don't know why they've been taken. They think they've been naughty. The lies that get told to them when they're taken, they don't want you. They turn to drugs, they turn to alcohol. They don't understand why they behave the way they do. They've been dispossessed in many ways. That you get a high suicide rate. And then you get the other side of the coin where they don't want to go back because of all the lies they were told. I never thought in my wildest dreams that I would have my little babies out there too. They stand there and tell you, you know, in their condescending attitude, I know how you feel. How, for God's sake, can anybody stand there and tell you, I know how you feel? And I said, don't go there with me. And they tell you, you're only making it worse. How worse does it get? When you're standing there and you're saying to your daughter, just let him take him. This is part of me also. I make no apology for being upset. It is the hardest thing you will ever do in your life, to tell your daughter to let him go. We'll sort it out later. We're still sorting it out. Australia needs to feel shame. Instead of putting us down and saying we need protecting, they need to start listening to us. They need to take on board what we're saying and consult with us. We're not asking for acceptance. We're not asking for understanding. We are demanding the right of equality. And that's what it's all about.
Racism is the core of a lot of the issues that we've talked about today. It has created the biggest vicious cycle through institutionalisation that we see child removal, that we see incarceration and criminalisation of Aboriginal people. We are seeing criminalisation occur as a result of being Indigenous, and that has been something that has occurred right from the beginning, from invasion. Racism is something, unfortunately, that also affects our health and our well-being. It's not something, the idea that we all got was, you know, sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never hurt you. They do hurt you. Especially if you're picking up bad press every day and you're reading bad news stories about yourself. If you've been suffering a curriculum wilderness, which most Indigenous people do, when did you learn about Aboriginal Australia? When did you learn about Pemaway and Windarang and our heroes? You didn't learn about those heroes. You didn't learn our story. And so that indoctrination of white hero discovery and worship across our country have impacted on our senses of well-being. Drugs and alcohol have become a very effective way of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. It's well recognised around the world, internationally. And yet, when our people use drugs and alcohol to deal with the pain and the trauma that they have, they're incarcerated. No one has sat down and talked to these, in particular, women or men about their stories. But we know from Bringing Them Home report, we know from the Royal Commissions and Deaths in Custody, that at least 50% of people who are in prison have been removed, have suffered great traumas. Just in Queensland this year, a survey was undertaken with men and women in prison where they showed that 80% of Indigenous people in prison had significant mental illnesses. 80% of the women inside had PTSD, and I'm going to tell you why. From the work we've been doing in a project called Scream in New South Wales, I interviewed 100 women from New South Wales in 6 of the prisons around New South Wales. At least 80% of those women had had their children removed from them. They were in prison as a result of I felt, and they explained, there was no other reason to be around. You know, they had lost what was important in their life. What we found was that, you know, women who were inside were constantly ringing docs day in, day out to try and get access to know where their children were. And docs were not responding, were not returning calls, were not providing information, were extending that sense of terror and trauma of not knowing where your children were. It's important also to know that Aboriginal women are the highest and fastest growing population in prison at the moment. When you put a mother inside, you take away the kids, you disperse the family, you take away culture, you take away education, you take away caring for old people. You've taken the core, most important,
the core of their being.
The core of the being. And you've also taken away and set up unfortunately, what I'm seeing is a vicious cycle. What happens when you've been in prison? What happens if you've been taken? Guess what? 1 in 8 people who've been taken will end up in prison. Guess what? If you've been in prison, then you're more likely to be in, your parents are going to be in prison, or your children are going to be in prison. So we've set this cycle up. This is a cycle of appalling government policy. And what everyone has said at this table is, we are the experts. We know how things should work amongst our community, how houses should be built, how we should have policies developed around us. We need to be consulted and not have ill-informed people making decisions on our behalf.
Whiteness thrust upon us.
Yes. And I just wanted to say another thing. Education is important. People need to know about the context for our current circumstances. If people were more aware and had access to this information, and it's not hard to pick a book off a library, out of the library, etc. There's plenty of resources out there to find. But again, well done, you marvellous, deadly women. Thank you for being who you are.